networks. You can find many conspiracy theories, and one of the most popular is that behind-the-scenes financial clans influence the course of world history. Is this really the case? Maybe it's not a conspiracy theory at all, but actual practice? It's just that secret intrigues are not something people like to write about in history textbooks. Or maybe the rumors about the influence of the Rothschilds and Rockefellers are exaggerated. Well, let's figure it out. After all, by analyzing how financial flows moved centuries ago and the personalities who set them in motion, we can see how their actions are still felt today. And we'll start with a phenomenon known as the Black Aristocracy of Europe. European aristocrats, heirs to ancient titles and fortunes, don't like to appear in the press and avoid lists. Forbes. Apennine economists ran an unusual study. They went to the Florence archive and checked the data on Florentine taxpayers in 1427 and compared it with the data from 2011. Even the researchers were surprised by the results. Among the wealthiest taxpayers of the 15th and 21st centuries, almost 900 surnames match. Throughout the 20th century, writers often revisited the decline of the aristocracy and old money. Poems and novels were written about the ruin of the nobility. Modern Europeans often picture aristocrats as eccentric old men, struggling to heat a few rooms in their crumbling, leaky-roofed ancestral castles. And suddenly it turned out that well-known aristocratic families survived all social upheavals. Despite world wars and revolutions, they managed to preserve and even increase their enormous fortunes, which are practically impossible to account for. The Cawdor Counts, referenced by Shakespeare in Macbeth, still reside in their ancestral castle today. The German princes Fürstenberg, whose lineage dates back to the 13th century, also reside in their family estates, castles, and princely palaces. And the legendary Schwarzenberg dynasty owns a whole dozen castles and palaces. Their most impressive property is a huge palace in the center of Vienna. Here's another fact. A third of all British land is owned by the Black Aristocracy. The Duke of Westminster owns part of the famous London districts, Mayfair and Belgravia. The central part of the English capital, Cadogan Square, part of Sloane Street and King's Road, is owned by Earl Cadogan, Baroness. Howard de Walden owns the prestigious London streets Harley Street and Marylebone High Street. All the properties located in these areas are rented out at the highest rates in the world. It is almost impossible to buy a house built by the landowner. For hundreds of millions of dollars, you only buy the right to lease a mansion for a period of 35 years or more. At the same time, the buyer also pays the owner an annual fee for renting the land under the house. European nobility seldom appears on Forbes lists. Why is that? Old money, unlike recently earned fortunes, prefers to stay quiet. Countless books, paintings, antique furniture, and works of art are kept in noble castles and palaces. It's impossible to even estimate their total value. That's something for Gates and Zuckerberg. Anyone can see how much these assets are valued on the market. The property of noble families, acquired over centuries, is securely hidden from outsiders. The English, for example, have long been trying to find out exactly which land Edward William Fitzalan Howard, the 18th Duke of Norfolk, owns. The Duke himself speaks modestly about his estates. "I'm just a simple farmer, and these are not just words." Even in such a modern structure as the Brussels bureaucracy, aristocrats have found their own feeding trough. Since they own hundreds of thousands of hectares of land, they present themselves as farmers and claim substantial subsidies allocated by the European Union to support agriculture. Every year, Farmers like Duke Marlborough, Duke Northumberland, Duke Westminster, and Lord Rothschild received from Brussels between £700,000 and £1 million sterling. It's difficult to estimate the officially declared wealth. What could originals by famous artists, Columbus letters, palaces in Seville and Madrid, and a first edition of Don Quixote owned by the 19th Duke of Alba's family be worth? Look at the fork! His fortune is estimated at between 600 million and 4.7 billion euros. The wide range of numbers shows how arbitrary the estimates are. You'd think the owners of this luxury would have been ruined by government taxes long ago. If an ordinary person tries to sell a house, a painting, or an antique, they are immediately hit with an unpleasant capital gains tax. In Spain, the rate goes up to 34%, and in England, up to 40%. Inheritance is subject to the same tax. But while ordinary Europeans are forced to immediately sell inherited property to pay off the tax authorities, their noble compatriots use workarounds. The most common method is transferring the palace and assets to a foundation. Naturally, the foundation is managed by the family members themselves. As a result, new generations receive extremely valuable property, but don't pay a cent to the budget. Other tricks are used when selling antiques. In 2001, the owners of Howard Castle in North Yorkshire sold a painting by the famous artist Joshua Reynolds for £9.4 million. To avoid paying taxes, they claimed that the painting was not a unique work of art, but rather a part of the castle's fabrics and upholstery. In 2014, the appellate court ruled in favor of the owners. Aristocrats prefer not to get involved with the social columns. The only exceptions are the Windsor royal family and the Duchess of Alba, who lost her mind in her old age. There are reasons for such modesty. First, it helps avoid public attention to wealth, unconventional ways of making money, and tax evasion. This is especially important as the middle class faces growing poverty. Secondly, aristocratic fortunes were almost always accumulated through criminal means. And it's not just about the legendary ancient times of enclosure, that is, the violent elimination of communal lands, piracy, colonial wars, and the slave trade. We'll talk about that a bit later. But throughout the entire 20th century, noble families survived and grew richer by cooperating with the most notorious political regimes. The Borghese and Torlonia princes supported Benito Mussolini. Duke Alba officially represented Francisco Franco in London. During World War II, Baron Thyssen-Bornemisza profited from collaborating with the Third Reich, and his daughter, Countess Margit, welcomed SS officers to her castle and threw parties for them. Paintings expropriated from Jews later became part of the famous Thyssen-Bornemisza art collection. All right, the bloody 20th century. But were earlier European aristocrats actually more noble? Let's take a look at the example of England. The scheme of British transnational drug trafficking, which operated for almost 200 years, was quite simple and effective, and was carried out through the British East India Company. It monopolized the industrial production of opium in Bengal, which was part of the British colony of India. It was there that the highest quality opium was produced. The lords of the British Empire became company members and shareholders. It was they who began to form a narco-civilization in China, turning an entire generation of Chinese people into opium addicts. Every British monarch since 1729 received huge profits from the drug trade. The East India Company shipped a significant portion of the drug to Europe, disguised as ordinary tea. Even now, profits from international drug trafficking are smoothly integrated into the European aristocratic common fund, mainly the English one. The Golden Triangle is the transit route for raw heroin from Asia to Europe. Its processing and conversion into the finished product are handled, for example, by laboratories on the coast of France. So any major financial flow is not just the prerogative of drug mafias, cartels, and syndicates, but a well-integrated mechanism within the ruling elites for replenishing family fortunes at the expense of human lives, the common people. Prince Charles controls the so-called Island Club, which includes 4,000 oligarchs from all the countries of the Commonwealth of Nations, the Union, Britain, and its former colonies. The Island Club is the financial and economic fist of the British monarchy, with which it can open or break down many doors. Additionally, 117 corporations headquartered in the City of London are among the world's 500 largest corporations. Most of these corporations are run by members of the House of Peers. The founders of the private printing press of the United States Federal Reserve System, Warburgs, Morgans, Rockefellers, and Rothschilds, who will be discussed later, are also either British peers or bankers of British peers. Only the lower House of Commons is elected in Britain, while the upper House of Peers has the authority to overturn the decisions of the lower house. It is hereditary? And how the grandfathers and great-grandfathers of today's peers started out is well known. They were representatives of such respectable professions as racketeer, robber, smuggler, pirate, drug dealer, arms dealer, and slave trader. According to political expert Lyndon LaRouche, Venice, with its model of an oligarchic empire practicing diplomacy aimed at pitting its opponents against each other, became the model that was transferred to England and the Netherlands. By the way, new financial manipulation technologies were first tested in the Netherlands. For example, the now popular and once useful 300-year-old external national debt. The Dutch were the first to realize that their debt could actually be traded, and traded for profit. Or here's another scheme. Imagine a bank that accepts deposits, issues bonds to borrowers, and pays interest, let's say, 6% per year. Each year, borrowers gather and receive interest for life. If one of them dies, their share is divided among the survivors. The loan is repaid after the last borrower dies, and the amount is not returned. With this scheme, it's enough to have a 6% reserve each year for the repayment of the entire debt, and the rest of the money can be used for any purpose. Here's another idea. Invest money in British national debt bonds at 8% per year and issue Dutch national debt bonds at 4% per year based on that. After all the manipulations, Koshern was left with his own 4% profit. Who came up with this manipulation? In 1785, about 25,000 people lived in Holland. Of these, about 5,000 were engaged in banking and investment activities. Of these 5,000, about 500 were the biggest banking tycoons not only in Holland, but in the world. The 25,000 people in Holland were split into Sephardim and Ashkenazim. By the late 18th century, Ashkenazim mainly traded with France and Germany, while Sephardim traded with England and the United States of America. Although there were exceptions, for example, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, who, being a German Jew, was the manager for Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel and was involved in selling soldiers to the English during the French Revolution and collecting bounties for the killed. Starting around 1785, the Bank of Amsterdam abandoned its 2-century-old policy of 100% reserve banking, which had made it the world's most reliable bank, reducing reserves first to 25% and later to 10%. At the same time, Dutch investments in foreign banks and industries increased several times over. Capital began to flee from Holland. Meanwhile, 90% of Holland's income was held by just 8% of the population. The whole country worked so that these 8% could fill their pockets and become even richer, while the people grew poorer. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? These 8% didn't really care about Holland. They felt just fine in London, New York, and Paris. They saw Holland as a place where a bunch of poor people paid taxes to cover foreign debt payments. To sum up, Holland is a unique example of a country destroyed by its own internal debt and the completely predatory, usurious nature of its banking economy. That's what historians say. What's surprising isn't that Holland left the stage of great European powers, but that it stayed afloat so long. But as the years went by, the Venetian model of an oligarchic empire, which had passed through England and Holland, underwent yet another mutation. The Malthusian concept, which predicts inevitable absolute overpopulation and justifies the extermination of entire peoples by the struggle for resources for the chosen states. However, we'll talk about that a bit later. To sum up everything that has been said, I would like to note that despite all the setbacks and changes of eras, the aristocratic families of Europe continue to thrive. Their wealth is a gray area of the global economy. Their hereditary rights and unofficial power are the flip side of European democracy. As Walter Rathenau, the founder of General Electric, said in 1909, 300 people, all of whom know each other, control the economic fate of Europe and choose their successors from among themselves. The only thing that can stop the aristocrats today is public opinion and publicity. Old money, as they say, loves silence. Well, let's continue to break that silence with our story. And let's take a closer look at the London City. Not so long ago, in February, there was a session of the International Court Grand Jury, the Court of Public Opinion, known as Nuremberg II. It's not exactly a powerful official body like the Hague Court. The status of this second Nuremberg is more like a public conference. A group of lawyers led by the well-known German attorney Dr. Rainer Füllmich set out to put an end to the criminal actions of government officials and international organizations, as well as business representatives, committed and being committed under the guise of fighting the pandemic. At the first stage, 6 suspects in the crimes have been identified. German virologist and head of the Institute of Virology, Christian Drosten, chief medical advisor to the American President, Anthony Fauci, head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, Bill Gates, the American financial holding BlackRock, and the American pharmaceutical corporation, Pfizer. All of this might seem like just another gathering of conspiracy theorists, if not for one thing. One of the speakers was the Englishman Alex Thompson, a former officer of the British Government Communications Headquarters, who gave an overview of the history of preparing the Great Reset Plan, which began a century before Schwab, about 150 years ago in Great Britain. The speaker said, "My name is Alex Thompson. I spent 8 years as an officer at the British Government Communications Intelligence Agency, a national security agency partner. There, I served as secretary for the former Soviet Union and decrypted intercepted materials in various languages, including Russian and German. In the second half of that period, I was also a member of an interdisciplinary group on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats." And then he said words that shocked many people, namely, "The City of London, the financial heart of the British Empire, is a dominant force in the world. The City of London still has a special legal status, apart from the 32 other London boroughs, and is actually not part of Greater London. Its privileges were established as far back as the Magna Carta of 1215, and its self-governance has never been challenged. Many times in its history, it held power over the British Crown, and therefore over a large piece of land," notes an officer of the English Special Services. Since around 1870, the financial capital of the city has established its dominance over the world. The city controls not only Britain, but also the entire British Commonwealth. Specifically, the governing body of the City of London is the Privy Council. One of the most powerful banks in the City of London, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, dates back to the era of the Chinese opium trade. Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation and other city banks have been involved in dirty business from the very beginning. Their executives and owners were outright criminals. From the very beginning, the dominance of city financial capital was based on money, debt, and financing the criminal trade in opium, slaves, and weapons. Even then, city financial magnates knew their money's power was temporary, and they needed to plan for the future. Financial power was to be replaced by a power based on the intellectual superiority of Anglo-Saxon rulers over all peoples, including their own, on the ability to control the minds of the masses, and on restricting other nations' access to the benefits of scientific and technological progress. A special role in reshaping the psychology and ideology of London as a world center was played by John Ruskin, an English writer, artist, and art theorist. While teaching at Oxford, he preached from the university lectern a doctrine according to which the British elite was obliged to export its worldview to all countries of the world. His student and follower was Cecil Rhodes, the future ideologist of British imperialism, who became fabulously wealthy from diamond mining in South Africa. In 1891, he created a secret society in Britain called the Round Table to prepare and implement a plan for establishing British rule over the world. Later, second circle organizations formed around this secret core, round table groups including the United States and 7 other countries. The Rhodes Scholarship Fund was established to train students capable of advancing British policy in different countries and on different continents. Recruitment of promising young people was carried out at Oxford, Cambridge, and other British universities. Lord Arnold Toynbee and Lord Alfred Milner became loyal followers of Rhodes. Here is what Cecil Rhodes wrote in his diaries. "Why don't we create a secret society with only one goal? To promote the British Empire and bring the entire civilized world under British rule." The true purpose and goal of creating the secret society is to spread the British worldview throughout the entire world. The colonization by British subjects of all lands where a livelihood can be achieved through energy, hard work, and enterprise. Especially the British occupation of all Africa, the Holy Land, the Euphrates Valley, Cyprus, Ceylon, South America, and Pacific Islands not yet under British control. The entire Malay archipelago, which is under China and Japan, and the final restoration of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire. This world domination plan had 2 parts. The first was to consolidate the Anglo-Saxon world. The second was to subjugate the rest of humanity. The main stronghold here was the City of London, a state within a state, slightly disguised by the signs of international banks. What is the Anglo-Saxon world? First of all, it's the United Kingdom. England plus Scotland plus Wales plus Northern Ireland. Secondly, 4 English-speaking countries, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have Anglo-Saxon majorities. Thirdly, the countries of the British Commonwealth of Nations. In addition to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, this covers 51 more countries, such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, and others. The Commonwealth accounts for 30% of the world's population and 21% of the land area. At first glance, it seems like all of this is some kind of clumsy parody of the much-publicized Freemasonry that everyone laughs at in the media. However, here's an interesting fact. In 1953, a certain Norman Dodd, an American banker, was the chief expert of a special committee investigating the activities of tax-exempt American foundations. This investigative committee was established by United States Congressman Carroll Reese, so it is usually called the Reese Committee. So, Dodd had access to secret documents and uncovered a lot of unexpected things about the largest charitable foundations in America: Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford. The founders of these foundations were followers of Rhodes's idea. They fought for the creation of a unified Anglo-Saxon empire. In their opinion, for the Anglo-Saxons to conquer the world, it was necessary to change the consciousness of other uncivilized peoples, and the best means for this could be war. Wars aren't just for conquering territory. The consequences. Rhodes's followers believed mental subjugation was more important. In 1909, the Carnegie Foundation, as Norman Dodd discovered, raised the question in secret meetings of how to involve the United States in a war. The Rockefeller and Ford foundations played a significant role in preparing for World War II and drawing the United States into it. In their opinion, this war was supposed to contribute to the formation of a unified Anglo-Saxon spirit and world. There is another illustrative example: Canada. In the mid-19th century, it seemed that Canada would adopt its own Declaration of Independence from the British Crown, similar to the American Declaration of 1776. But thanks to the support of the British agent John Alexander Macdonald, in 1867, a constitution was adopted that legalized the creation of a united Canada from 4 provinces as a dominion of Britain. Macdonald said that he was born a Briton and wanted to die a Briton. These words from Canada's first Prime Minister were seen by sovereignty supporters as a cynical betrayal. Cecil Rhodes' secret roundtable included a group in the United States and in Canada. At the end of the 19th century, Wilfrid Laurier became the Prime Minister of Canada. He wanted to free the country from British influence, but in 1911 he was overthrown. Later, Laurier openly wrote, "Canada is now governed by a junta sitting in London, known as the Round Table, with branches in Toronto, Winnipeg, and Victoria. The Round Table brought the government under complete control, even in Britain itself." From 1908 to 1916, the Prime Minister of Britain was Herbert Henry Asquith. Then he was replaced by the obedient David Lloyd George, who was dictated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The main public figure representing the Round Table conspirators was Lord Milner, who was introduced to Lloyd George. In the United States, such a figure was Colonel Edward Mandell House, who was introduced to Woodrow Wilson. Bernard Baruch was introduced to President Franklin Roosevelt, whom we'll talk about a bit later. He also mentored the next president, Truman. So what does this mean? London managed to bring the United States under its control. Of course, this issue is not as simple as it seems. Usually, the United States is put in first place by economic indicators, but such an obvious fact is not taken into account. In the latter 20th century, another invisible empire replaced the British colonial empire. Have you guessed what it's called? That's right, the offshore one. Most so-called independent offshore jurisdictions are actually controlled by London, the City of London, and the Bank of England. They also overlook or downplay the influence of Humane Albion's secret societies and British intelligence services. These 5 countries, Great Britain, the United States of America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, have coordinated intelligence activities as the Five Eyes since 1930. Or, for example, there are also the Agents of the Crown, a structure with a long and dark history. It's basically a tool for managing the empire's colonial infrastructure. This secret global network has a public tip of the iceberg, the Crown Agents Foundation. As always, this white and fluffy non-profit organization acts as the founder of a huge number of business structures. Members of this Crown Agents Foundation include Standard Chartered Bank, one of the oldest and most influential banks in the City of London, the International Corporation Unilever, the International Chamber of Commerce of the United Kingdom, as well as Transparency International, the Royal Commonwealth Society, the Caribbean Council, and many other structures and organizations. The geography of Crown Agents' activities and its business structure extends far beyond the British Commonwealth. This agency of the British Crown is also present in some former Soviet republics. The organization's activities are referred to as consulting services. These services cover healthcare, agriculture, foreign trade, customs, banking, and domestic trade. Crown Agents' employees promote their people to key positions in government structures and make some local citizens their own people. Until the end of the 20th century, the main tool of global Anglo-Saxon expansion was the money of the banks of the London City. They worked on preparing wars, revolutions, economic crises, and other upheavals. Today, territorial conquests of the old type have faded into the background. Money as a tool is now secondary. But it wasn't always like this. There was a time when money was in first place. For example, in the rise of the Rothschild clan. It seems that this clan is so powerful, its influence is so great, that it could even turn off this screen. Then cracks will start to form on it. But before moving on to the story about the actions of this family and their founder, a little introductory information. Mayer Amschel was born 280 years ago in Frankfurt in 1744. He founded his first bank, which was actually an antique shop where you could exchange money, right there in the same place. At the age of 27, Mayer married 17-year-old Gutla Schnapper, and later their 5 sons, namely Amschel, Solomon, Nathan, Carmen, and Jacob, continued his work in the major financial centers of that time: Frankfurt, Vienna, Paris, Naples, and London. It was this group of 5 that spread their strong roots throughout the world. Mayer Amschel also had 5 daughters: Janet, Isabella, Babette, Julie, and Henrietta, whose husbands were not allowed to participate in the family business and could only serve as labor. Additionally, when discussing Rothschild, Mayer Amschel, and his actions against humanity, it's important to note the actions of a clan of over 100 people. Because the family values and mission of this lineage still unite hundreds of relatives into a single whole to this day. The founder of the Rothschild family died in 1812. Before his death, he drew up a partnership agreement and a will in which he outlined the principles for the future management of the family business. Here are these eloquent instructions from Rothschild to his children. First, all important positions in the business must be held only by family members. Only male descendants can participate in the affairs, and only direct male heirs can inherit. The eldest son becomes the head of the family, unless the brothers unanimously decide otherwise. Second, the men of the family must marry their cousins or second cousins so that the accumulated property remains within the family and serves the common cause. Daughters must marry aristocrats while keeping their faith. Third, in any case, do not describe the family's property. Do not disclose the size of the fortune, even in court or in a will. Disputes between brothers should be resolved within the family, maintaining the unity of the household. Fourth, big money likes silence. It is worth noting that the Rothschilds still follow this last piece of advice to this day. After all, the family members are not known for fabulous wealth, at least officially, but there are legends about the family's influence. Well, now let's show the most significant achievement among all the various deeds accomplished by members of the Rothschild family: the creation of the Jewish state. Did you know that it was the Rothschilds who invested millions of pounds in the colonization of Palestine? Baron Edmund de Rothschild, a member of the French branch of the Rothschilds, actively bought land in Palestine and provided strong financial support to the first Jewish settlers in these areas. The Rothschilds' money and the religious political idea of Zionism, which proclaimed worldwide Jewish domination and was put forward by the founder of the World Zionist Organization, Theodor Herzl, later determined the fate of the creation of the future Jewish state in the 20th century. This mission is also closely connected with the support of Hitler, sponsoring Hitler. The Rothschilds, along with the Rockefellers, were the financial power that stood behind the Nazi leader. Adolf Hitler rose to power with financial help from accounts in the Bank of England and other banking organizations in England and America. For example, through the Kuhn Loeb Ampersand Commerz Bank. Paul Warburg, representing the Rothschild dynasty, led it. We'll discuss him later. It should also be noted that the heart of Nazi military power was the association of German chemical companies known as Interessengemeinschaft Farben. In America, this conglomerate had its own branch, and one of its directors was Max Warburg, the brother of Paul Warburg, and, accordingly, also a representative of the Rothschild dynasty. During the first two world wars, the largest news agencies in Germany were owned by the Rothschilds. With their help, they controlled the flow of information from Germany to other countries. It turned out to be surprising that, against the backdrop of Germany's almost completely destroyed industrial enterprises, the factories of the Farben conglomerate were not affected by the massive air raids. Baron Rothschild financed both the Jewish colony in Palestine and Adolf's election campaign simultaneously. The goal was simple: to convince the Jews to leave Europe and create their new empire in Palestine. To spread the global project of the banking system. It's no secret that the Rothschild family, starting from the time of Mayer Amschel, has slowly but surely established their central banks in every country in the world over the centuries, giving them an incredible amount of wealth and power. Around 1815, this family took over the Bank of England and expanded their control over banks in countries all around the world. Their method was, and still is, to force corrupt politicians in a country to take out huge loans from their central banks, loans they will never be able to repay. That's why they are constant clients and debtors. Nathan Rothschild clearly described how to use technology to subjugate governments and states. Here's his quote: "Whoever controls the issuance of money controls the government, and it doesn't matter which puppet sits on the throne of the British Empire. The man who controls the issuance of money in Britain controls the British Empire. The best of the Frankfurt Five." That's precisely how you describe Rothschild Mayer Amschel's third son, Nathan. He, the founder of the English branch of the Rothschilds, often stood out among his brothers for his ability to make big money. In 1811, he founded N.M. Rothschild, now known as N.M. Rothschild Ampersand Sons. Here are, for example, 3 brilliant moves in which Nathan made a big profit for the family. Thanks to him, in 1814, the British government involved his bank in financing the military campaign against Napoleon. Large sums in gold, over £11 million in a year, were transferred from England to Marshal Wellington and the Allies through the brothers' banks. Another interesting historical fact is when Nathan Rothschild earned £40 million sterling thanks to information he received before others, which allowed his family to make a guaranteed profit on the stock exchange. This refers to the Battle of Waterloo. Nathan, having learned about the victory over Napoleon a day earlier than anyone else in London, came to the stock exchange with a sad face and started selling government bonds. Seeing this, the brokers decided that the English and their allies had been defeated and rushed to get rid of their securities for next to nothing. After waiting for the crash, the agents of the cunning Nathan bought up the cheapened government bonds. It was in this way that Nathan earned a fabulous sum for his family for those times: £40 million. Another grand financial achievement of the third Rothschild son was the loan he issued to the British government, an astonishing £20 million sterling, to compensate slave owners in the Dominions after the abolition of slavery. Just think about that. The government borrowed money from him to compensate slave-trading oligarchs for losses from the end of slavery, who, like Nathan Rothschild at the London Stock Exchange, seemed visibly upset. But let's not delve into the biography of this particular clan, because we have other characters waiting for us. Naturally, after Rothschild, the next logical step is to discuss the second well-known surname. On a warm August morning in 1923, a 7-year-old boy named David caught a large brown beetle in a meadow. The insect, with its menacing jaws, tried to bite the boy, but the beetle didn't know whose hands it had fallen into. David wasn't afraid, put it in a jar, brought it home, waited for the beetle to die, and pinned it with a needle. He liked this process so much that later it became the passion of his whole life. It would seem touching, such a love for nature from early childhood. If Rockefeller hadn't described in detail in his diaries exactly which gasoline or acetone he used and how long he suffocated insects for his collection, David, the cherished grandson of Dynasty founder John Rockefeller, inherited both a multi-billion-dollar fortune and the family's belief in the exclusivity of the wealthy. Here is this sweet old man handing out tips to his servants. Grandpa Rockefeller and his growing grandson began to help a young German politician, Adolf Schicklgruber, who, with his own adjustments, began to bring this idea to life. The Rockefeller Bank at John Pierpont Morgan gave Hitler $11 billion to create a better world and the best people in the world. And they also sent their own eugenics specialists from the United States to help. Hitler's defeat didn't bother the Rockefellers at all. Already in the 1950s, David, together with scientists who had fled from Nazi Germany, turned the entire country of Puerto Rico into his laboratory. By 1965, every third woman on the island had been sterilized. Sometimes, peasant women were not warned about this, with sterilization being passed off as prevention of typical female diseases. But that wasn't enough for them. Doctors from the Rockefeller Institute infected Puerto Ricans with cancer cells, and in case the test subjects died, they weren't upset at all. Here are entries from Dr. Cornelius Rautz's diary. Puerto Ricans are, without a doubt, the dirtiest, laziest, mostly degenerate and thieving race of people ever to inhabit this sphere. What this island needs is not health care, but a tidal wave or something else to wipe it out. I completely exterminated this population. I did everything I could to further the process of extermination. Having killed 8, didn't I? The scandalous excerpt appeared in Time magazine, and it seemed that these inhumane experiments would finally come to an end. But the opposite happened. Dr. Roots was promoted to the Pentagon to develop biological weapons, and Puerto Ricans continued to die. As soon as he had the opportunity, David began to visit the Soviet Union regularly. It was called cultural cooperation. But all the heartfelt conversations with the country's top political leadership had only one goal. And so, 10 years of meetings and conversations bore fruit. 1972 marked the first United States presidential visit to the Soviet Union. Nixon met Brezhnev and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement and an anti-ballistic missile system pact. There was also scientific, cultural, and technological exchange. Historians will call this period détente. But no, this is business, David Rockefeller would have replied. Behind the loud political statements, no one would notice that the Rockefellers were allowed into the oil industry of the Soviet Union. The Soviets also bought $1 billion worth of grain from America. The first Rockefeller Bank Chase office will open in central Moscow as early as 1973. The billionaire describes in detail in his memoirs how they celebrated the opening of the first office on a grand scale. All communist officials in Moscow were invited to the gala at the Metropole Hotel. The tables were overflowing with imported delicacies and expensive alcohol. The dock workers descended like locusts, and within 2 minutes, not a crumb or a drop was left. Rockefeller remembers how the wife of one of the guests was hiding a piece of sausage in her purse. How can you be afraid of and consider such miserable people your enemies? The billionaire wondered, and he was sowing the seeds of democracy, which sprouted in just 10 years. Rockefeller took a special jar with him on every business trip, where he put the beetles he caught for his collection. Former intelligence officer David, like a spider, was entangling the state in his own web of foundations. Rockefeller's classmate, Allen Dulles, became the first CIA director and worked from Rockefeller Center until the agency had its own building. Is it even necessary to mention the billionaire's influence on intelligence services? The uncooperative president of Lebanon. Here you go, dear David. A coup d'etat, unfavorable oil prices, a global crisis, and a stock market crash. To live like a Rockefeller means not only to live richly, but also in God mode. You execute and pardon so that skyscrapers don't block out the sun. In your office, you call your brother, the governor, who shifts the World Trade Center construction a few meters over. The area of interest isn't just a region, but an entire planet. David Rockefeller creates the exclusive Bilderberg Club, where presidential candidates from dozens of countries come to be evaluated. He also organized the Trilateral Commission, where the fate of America, Western Europe, and Asia is decided. As cynical as it may sound, he was the chairman of an international group on issues of peace and prosperity. In fact, it was, is, and will be. The Rockefeller clan's main aim is to instill love, fear, and obedience toward the wealthy superhuman in people worldwide. As long as the peoples of the earth, especially in Asia and Africa, do not agree to regulate birth rates and artificially reduce the population, the future of the planet remains in serious question. One of the most obvious organizations that does not wait for United Nations approval and is already methodically working on reducing the Earth's population is called the Rockefeller Foundation. Even before the start of World War II, the Rockefeller Foundation was actively funding scientific research to plan a post-war world empire. Ordinary people play computer strategy games, but the global strategy for real countries and nations is developed for them by the Rockefeller Foundation. It is still the source of salaries for thousands of researchers and analysts who use their expertise to study areas of interest for the clan. The Rockefellers have always chosen these areas and reached their own conclusions independently, considering their interests. Until 1939, the Rockefeller Foundation financed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. Back then, it was called eugenics. They wanted to eliminate or sterilize the unfit. But the thing is, the rest of the so-called unfit members of humanity, in their view, don't want to admit that they are unfit. That's why the Rockefellers had to repackage eugenics as the issue of population control. So, if you ever hear about family planning or the problem of overpopulation somewhere, just know this. These are just words that the rulers of the world use instead of the more palatable term depopulation policy and elimination of surplus mouths. After all, back in the 1950s, with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Population Council was established to control birth rates on the planet. There isn't a single crisis that doesn't benefit them. Of course, they're the ones who organize them. The oil shock of 1973 was orchestrated by the Bilderberg Group, which, in turn, was created by the Rockefellers in the 1950s. All the blame for this crisis was placed on the Arab oil sheikhs. But as a result, the Rockefeller banks became the largest in the world. In '79, they created the debt crisis of the third world countries. They artificially devalued the national currencies in countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, and then bought up the most valuable assets at ridiculously low prices. GMOs are a crucial issue of influence and global governance. The debate about harm or benefit is just one side of the coin here. No less important is the global control over the planet's food supply, and the easiest way to seize the food market is with disposable mutant seeds. To replant them, you'll have to buy them again. Not so long ago, the largest agro-industrial corporations around the world were merged. Because due to information leaks, the corporations Monsanto and Syngenta got a bad reputation. After the merger, these corporations turned into the friendly Bayer and Chemchina. They also merged the companies Dow Chemicals and DuPont. Thus, now only 3 giant multinational corporations in the world control most of the human food pyramid. One of the most striking examples of their attitude toward the human biomass, to which these corporations feed various products, is glyphosate. Glyphosate-based herbicides began to be used in agriculture since the 1970s. Thanks to the infamous Monsanto, which can rightfully be called the main monster corporation on the planet. Soon enough, yellow spots began to appear on the green fields. Sudden death syndrome affected up to 40% of the crop. The broad-spectrum herbicide wiped out both weeds and cultivated plants. Help from the corporation came from an unexpected source, from genetic scientists. Genetic engineering methods helped Monsanto develop GMO varieties of agricultural crops that are resistant to glyphosate. Scorpion and flounder genes came in very handy. The scientists rejoiced. Sudden plant death syndrome seemed to be a thing of the past. Glyphosate destroyed everything except the transgenic soybeans. The chemicals started being poured onto the fields by the ton. But this did not go unnoticed. Glyphosate became a weapon of mass destruction. The decision of the California Superior Court jury on August 10, 2018, in favor of Dwayne Johnson, had the effect of a bomb exploding. In his lawsuit against the Monsanto company, a gardener from California accused the corporation of causing him serious harm to his health. Due to constant contact with glyphosate, he developed lymphoma, which progressed rapidly. By court decision, the plaintiff was awarded compensation in the amount of $280 million. But you can't buy health for any amount of money. At the time of the verdict, Johnson had the final stage of blood cancer, and he had only a few months left to live. There are currently more than 5,000 similar lawsuits in courts of various instances. The high biological activity of glyphosate is evident in the fact that it destroys all living things, becoming a truly serious threat to humans. Manufacturers also fail to list any potential dangers on the packaging. The official statistics are alarming in scale. In 1974, 1.4 million tons of glyphosate were poured onto the fields of the United States. By 2010, this figure had risen to 276 million. The World Health Organization has long been sounding the alarm. Glyphosate, accumulating in the tissues of the body, can cause cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the World Health Organization, released a report in 2015 stating the carcinogenic effects of glyphosate on humans. Numerous scientific studies have proven that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor. It can cause severe diseases in adults and mutations in children. Medical statistics show a direct correlation between the use of glyphosate and the increase in cases of infertility, thyroid dysfunction, liver and kidney diseases, and so on. Such publications, like many other articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals proving the harm of glyphosate, were called fake by the herbicide's defenders, while they forgot to mention that most studies on glyphosate's safety were sponsored by Monsanto itself. The corporation also concealed its cooperation with officials from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, who actively opposed research into the carcinogenicity of the compound. What path does glyphosate take before it enters the human body? Soybeans grow on land treated with glyphosate, and then they are used to produce meal, animal feed. Then, through meat and milk, the deadly glyphosate makes its way to the human table. European and American farmers note the progressive reproductive disorders in cows, the birth of offspring with physiological abnormalities, which is proportional to the use of glyphosate in animal feed. All imported soy, as well as soybean meal for animal feed, is heavily treated with glyphosate. Glyphosate even gets into drinking water, and people absorb it, even through mother's milk. Unfortunately, this is not a figure of speech. In different regions of Germany, independent experts took samples of women's breast milk. The test results were shocking. The maximum allowable glyphosate content in the samples was exceeded by 2 to 4 times. The highly toxic herbicide leads to developmental defects in children. The most serious of these is autism. When glyphosate enters the body, it damages the intestinal mucosa and thus is one of the causes of the so-called leaky gut syndrome, increased intestinal permeability. As a result, toxins enter the bloodstream and reach the brain and other organs. Europe is sounding the alarm. For example, in France, they are currently investigating multiple cases of children being born with atrophied limbs, and they are leaning toward the idea that the likely cause is herbicides. The brand name of the most popular glyphosate-containing herbicide by Monsanto is Roundup, which translates as circular defense. The name is quite fitting for the situation developing around the use of this product. The lobbying efforts of glyphosate producers have reached such a scale that the United States Congress signed a law protecting the Monsanto Corporation from any claims. In America, Monsanto controls 80% of the genetically modified corn market and 93% of the transgenic soybean market. Mass protests broke out in Europe in November 2017 after the European Commission extended the license for the use of glyphosate in agriculture in European Union countries for another 5 years. By 2024, Europe plans to officially ban the use of products containing glyphosate. The campaign to abandon glyphosate has recently united hundreds of thousands of people, and the official petition to stop using the product has gathered millions of signatures. But corporations, as if ignoring all of this, continue to talk about their peacekeeping mission, publishing numerous reviews of their missionary activities and cynically advertising their fight against hunger in developing countries. But this all began almost half a century ago. Experiments with GMOs were started by the Rockefeller Foundation back in 1984. At that time, the foundation launched a program to modify the genome of rice, and over 17 years invested more than $100 million just in GMO rice and its distribution. Why rice specifically? Because it's the main food for almost 3 billion people. Rice was being modified under a pretty wrapper. Enrichment with vitamin A, a deficiency that is a real problem for Asian countries. However, to get the necessary dose of this vitamin, you would have to eat 9 kilograms of GMO rice a day. So, basically, it didn't solve any problems at all. However, using this pretext, the test population eagerly accepted the idea. Then they started experimenting with soy. Soy has always been animal feed. It's exclusively a fodder crop, and it's absolutely unsuitable for human consumption. But it's very profitable for corporations to produce it. That's why, after a while, they convinced people that soy protein could replace other types of protein. That's how soy became human food as well. What else did they do? For example, they patented a sunflower variety with a high content of oleic acids and made it clear to the whole world that now breeding any other varieties with a high content of oleic acids would violate their copyright. And here's a small example from recent history. After the war in Iraq, International Monetary Fund rule was established there, which allowed the entire food industry of Iraq to be switched to GMO seeds in just a few years. The Rockefeller Foundation took over the largest gene banks, including the rice gene bank in Iraq and the one in the Philippines. On paper, they are under their trust management. It sounds nice, but this allows them to take seeds from these banks, modify them, and then patent them. That way, they become their property. Some honest scientists speak out about the threat that GMOs pose to the planet's biodiversity, but this doesn't really affect the global promotion of GMO technologies. Because, first of all, the Rockefeller Foundation has thousands of other well-paid scientists who simply flood the field with their positive materials, drowning out those who like to tell the truth. Well, secondly, they've created their own doomsday vaults, so for them personally, there's no threat to biodiversity. They've made sure to preserve everything for themselves. If the need arises, the Rockefeller Foundation will sell all of this to the rest of the world, like when the Dynasties founder sold candy to his sisters as a child. But are the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, who are in plain sight, really the main villains of the planet? A few years ago, it became known that a single international trust was created between the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. This fact puzzled many analysts, because the entire 20th century was marked by the rivalry between these two families. The official version is as follows. The two clans are joining forces to survive the waves of the global economic crisis. But what really happened? The first strange thing about the new alliance is that the superfamilies combined only a total of $40 billion. Such amounts might seem decent to Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, but not to the world's leading financial clans. Today, the combined wealth of the Rothschilds, according to rough estimates, exceeds $4 trillion, while the Rockefellers' total capital is about $1 trillion less in the same range. It turns out that the merging of capitals is not a bid for survival, but a clear claim to dominance in the post-crisis world. Just the tip of the iceberg in elite power struggles. But if the Rothschild-Rockefeller alliance is preparing to fight someone, it means they are not the top figures in the world of global financial backstage. Mayer Rothschild, the founder of the dynasty, was born in Germany in 1744, and the head of the clan, the American John Rockefeller Sr., was born almost 100 years later. And if these are relatively young families from a historical perspective, then who was running the planet when the Rothschilds and Rockefellers were still children? Maybe it was the family whose members established their Standard Chartered Bank a couple of hundred years earlier, back in 1613. In 1881, the Baruch family moved to New York, and the young Bernard enrolled in City College. After graduating, he worked as a broker on the New York Stock Exchange, and in 1903 he founded his own brokerage firm. Contrary to the trend at the time of merging into trust companies, Bernard Baruch ran his rather successful brokerage business supposedly on his own. His rise was guaranteed by support from the oldest clan. But for the public, Bernard earned the nickname the Lone Wolf of Wall Street, and by the age of 33, he became a millionaire, managing to grow his fortune even during the ongoing crises in the United States. Since 1912, Baruch has been playing the political card by financing Woodrow Wilson's election campaign. In gratitude for his support, Wilson brings him into the Department of National Defense. During World War I, Baruch becomes the head of the United States War Industries Board and sets in motion the arms buildup, which allows the country to temporarily overcome a series of economic crises. It was Baruch, as the president's advisor, who persuaded Wilson to support the idea of creating the Federal Reserve. And since 1913, the United States government has delegated the authority to print dollar bills to the commercial entity known as the Federal Reserve System. After the revolution in Russia, Baruch suddenly became a supporter of cooperation with the Soviet Union. Together with Hammer and Harriman, Lenin invites him to help restore the national economy of the Soviet country. Some of the first factories built by Americans in Russia in the 1920s and 1930s were tractor plants in Volgograd, Kharkov, and Chelyabinsk. Of course, these factories had a dual purpose. Besides tractors, they also began producing tanks, armored vehicles, and other weapons. The vehicles needed for the army were produced at two main factories, the Gorky plant and the Likhachev plant, which was built with subsidies from Henry Ford. In the 1930s, two huge steel plants were also built by American companies, in Magnitogorsk and Kuznetsk. Baruch and like-minded American and British bankers made a creative move at the decade's end, anticipating global developments. He achieves the reorientation of the American economy toward serving the military-industrial complex by artificially collapsing it and plunging it into a crisis. He demonstrates his actions to a rather promising British politician, Winston Churchill, whom he invites to America under the pretext of giving lectures. 1929. On October 24, 1929, as the New York Stock Exchange crashed, Baruch took Churchill to Wall Street, where a frantic crowd gathered outside the exchange. He shares with Churchill the information that he had stopped playing the stock market a year before the crash. He sold all his stocks and bought United States government bonds instead, ensuring the preservation of his capital from devaluation. This greatly impressed Churchill, and from then on, his friendship with Baruch became both personal and a strategic partnership. It was Baruch and Churchill who became the active organizers of the game to strengthen and then pit against each other Germany and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1933, the United States established full diplomatic relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and Bernard Baruch and top American politicians welcomed Soviet plenipotentiaries Maxim Litvinov and Yevgeny Rosenholz to America to develop a joint course of action. It should not be forgotten that after the revolution, Litvinov was the Bolshevik envoy in London, and in December 1917 wrote a rather interesting letter of recommendation to the British diplomat and intelligence officer Lockhart. Regarding Trotsky, I believe his presence in Russia benefits our interests. Here's another detail about Litvinov in 1939. It would seem that Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin holds all the power in the country. But here's the problem. The direct betrayal of the then People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, that very Litvinov, was revealed. He was better known in certain circles as Meyer Genoch Moiseyevich Wallach. What the authoritative and competent agencies did with traitors to the motherland in those days is well known. They punished them, sometimes very harshly and swiftly. And what could the all-powerful Stalin do, who, according to contemporaries' recollections, spoke at a government meeting about Litvinov's betrayal? Valaka, barely managing to keep calm, did nothing serious. He asked Litvinov to write a letter of resignation and put him under house arrest at Litvinov's comfortable dacha. And that's it. And the traitor is just as comfortable. He died in 1951 at the honorable age of 75. It turns out that even Stalin couldn't dictate terms to these people. But let's get back to Baruch, whose interests were not limited to the European theater of war. In 1934, in cooperation with the United States Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, he carried out an unprecedented operation to exchange China's gold reserves for a stack of papers in the form of bonds. Driven into a corner, Chiang Kai-shek, suffering one defeat after another, agreed to this exchange. As a result, businessmen from the United States received at least 100 tons of gold bars and a huge amount of silver, jewelry, and antiques. And Chiang Kai-shek got 250 sheets of paper and a peaceful old age on the island of Taiwan. By the early 1940s, Baruch was already a billionaire, but the peak dividends from his politically involved business came during the years of World War II and the post-war nuclear arms race. The Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1941 may have been a surprise for some, but not for Baruch. For the banking oligarchy, the price of this provocation was that America was drawn into World War II, and the oligarchs, especially Baruch, made a huge profit. During World War II, Baruch continued to advise the government and had a strong influence on the allocation of government military contracts. Billions of dollars were allocated to fund the areas they suggested. In 1944, thanks to the skillful maneuvering of Baruch and his partners at Bretton Woods, war-torn Europe and the Soviet Union agreed to recognize the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency. After World War II, Baruch took charge of overseeing the United States nuclear program and brought the atomic industry under his control. Baruch wants to rule the world, the moon, and maybe Jupiter. But we'll see about that, wrote President Truman in his diary. This phrase clearly shows who was actually making the important decisions, while the president could only envy and couldn't openly oppose. With the start of the arms race, which brought enormous profits to American military contractors, Baruch personally oversaw the production of the American atomic bomb under the motto, "We must move forward with the atomic bomb in one hand and the cross in the other." After the United States demonstrated its power by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union took all possible steps to restore nuclear parity. In this situation, the United States hurried, on the one hand, to convince the world community of its peaceful intentions, and on the other hand, carried out a clever scheme aimed at bringing the development of nuclear energy worldwide under American control. Of course, the initiator of such a grand plan was none other than Baruch, whom President Harry Truman appointed as the United States representative to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. At its first meeting on June 14, 1946, the American delegation proposed the total prohibition of nuclear weapons, known as the Baruch Plan. On the surface, the plan seemed to pursue noble goals, but it also called for international inspections by the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, while granting it the authority to take enforcement measures against violators. Additionally, the veto power of permanent United Nations Security Council members would not apply to its decisions. And this is where Baruch's plans ran into Stalin's distrust, as he understood that their implementation would slow down the Soviet Union's progress toward developing its own nuclear capability, which was necessary to ensure its own security. The Soviet delegation at the United Nations Conference took advantage of the fact that the Americans' proposals fundamentally contradicted the United Nations Charter and its structure, and imposed a veto. So how did it all end for Baruch? It didn't. Since 1949, a nuclear arms race began in the world, accompanied by the development of tactics and strategies for ideological sabotage, where Bernard Baruch felt like a fish in water. Until his old age, he personally managed business affairs. By the end of his life, the assets of the firms and funds under his control reached $1 trillion. Surprisingly, the Master of Destinies did not hide from people, was very easy to talk to, chatted with people relaxing in the park, and found out what their moods and wishes were. And there was no visible security around him. Baruch passed away. In 1965, in a simple cemetery on the outskirts of New York, there were no fences or grand monuments on his grave, just a modest small slab on the lawn. It's amazing that today nothing at all is known about the heirs to Bernard Baruch's trillion-dollar fortune, his grandchildren or great-grandchildren. An all-powerful hand erased all the information. There are also no group photos from Bernard Baruch's funeral, since his successors, who didn't want to be seen, were surely present in them. Who currently manages the colossal assets of the trillionaire owner is unknown. The Baruch Bank, founded 400 years ago, now modestly sits in the 4th decade of the world rankings. Because there is the Bank of Banks, which doesn't need any rankings, and then there are all the others. And it's no coincidence that in the global September 11th scenario, the International Department of the Standard Chartered Bank headquarters was located in an additional building that supposedly collapsed on its own. In a matter of seconds, financial transactions worth trillions of dollars disappeared in the ruins, and dozens of tons of gold were written off. But it's time to move on to the next clan, whose influence on the fate of the Russian Empire is hard to overestimate. They used to say about him, "Nothing Jewish is foreign to his heart." The American Jewish Encyclopedia Judaica provides the following biographical information about Yaakov Schiff. Yaakov Henry Schiff, an American financier and philanthropist, was born in Germany and came from a distinguished rabbinical family. The founder of this family, Schiff Meyer ben Yaakov ha-Kohen, was a prominent Talmudist and rabbinical author. Yaakov Schiff received both secular and religious education at a local school, following in the footsteps of his father, Moisey, who was a partner at the Rothschild Bank. At the age of 18, Schiff emigrated to the United States, where he joined a brokerage firm in New York and became a partner at Budge Schiff & Co. In 1875, he married the daughter of Solomon Liub, who was the head of the banking firm Kuhn Loeb Co., and joined the Testi firm. And, just like in that joke, that's when his luck really changed. This bank was founded in 1867 by Abram Kuhn and Solomon Liub. After the wedding, Schiff turned the bank, in which the main capital belonged to his wife's father, into one of the largest in America, and then bought out Abram Kuhn's share. Notably, the funds for this deal were provided by the Rothschilds. It's also interesting that in 1894, the senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb & Co. Chadintiders, Felix Warburg, who will be mentioned later, married Schiff's daughter, Frida. In turn, their daughter married Walter Nathan Rothschild in 1916. All according to the wishes of the clan leader, all the characters are closely connected by family ties. But let's go back to Schiff, who was not limited to banking activities alone, but also invested in industry. This included metallurgy, electrical, telegraph, and later telephone companies. Investments in the development of railroads brought in a good profit. As one of the leaders of the Jewish community in the United States, Schiff financed the creation of the Jewish Theological Seminary and Jewish departments in public libraries in the United States. He was also the vice president of the United States Chamber of Commerce, served on the New York City Board of Education, and held many honorary positions. His biography contains many examples of supporting the chosen people. And everything would be fine if it hadn't harmed the world around us, especially you and me. Let's look at the three main goals that Schiff supposedly pursued, which ultimately changed the course of our future development. To support any opponent of Tsarist Russia, Yakov Schiff provided large loans to the American government, as well as to the governments of foreign countries. The largest, totaling $200 million, was a loan to Japan during the Russo-Japanese War. Schiff believed the Tsarist regime in Russia had anti-Semitic policies. Let's take a closer look at this issue. The first pretext for starting active assistance to the revolutionaries was the announced campaign for granting all rights to Jews. Banker Schiff stated this to Vita quite openly. Tell your sovereign that if the Jewish people do not receive rights voluntarily, then those rights will be seized with the help of the revolution. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian government made significant concessions for the Jews, and at that time, Russia was almost the only country where the working Jewish people lived. That is, unlike in France, Germany, and especially the United States, where Jews were mainly engaged in money lending and business. Millions of Jews lived in Russia, working hard by the sweat of their brow, but Russian Jewry was becoming stratified. If the older generation read the Torah, went to synagogue, respected the law, and was against revolutionary upheavals, the younger generation read Marx, didn't go to synagogue, and laughed at the customs of their ancestors. International secret societies took advantage of these divisions. How did Nikolai II try to negotiate with Jewish rabbis, and how did he make contact with the Rothschilds? What did Russian intelligence learn from the transcript of the meeting of 5 Jewish billionaires? Why was Stolypin killed? All these questions are closely connected, and we are ready to talk about them. But should we? Like this film if you think we should. If we get enough likes, we'll include these topics in new episodes. But let's get back to Schiff. In February 1904, he gathered representatives of Jewish community organizations at his home and told them that in no more than 2 days, a war would break out between Japan and Russia. How did he know this in advance? The banker also said that he had been approached with a request for a loan for the Japanese government. Schiff wanted to hear the opinions of those present on how this might affect the situation of their fellow believers in Russia. And, as we understand, the majority voted in favor of granting the loan to Japan. Of course, later he refused to grant loans to Russia and influenced other banks so that they would not do it either. Preparation for a mass political strike in Russia. Schiff, who called Russia the enemy of humanity, arranged for his son-in-law, the German banker Max Warburg, who was part of his financial empire, to provide a loan to Germany from America, because he believed that all joint efforts should be made if they are directed against Russia. Trotsky, Gelfand, Zhivatovsky, Warburg, Schiff. Remember this sequence of names. Now we will reveal the details of this operation. There was a man named Alexander Parvus. In fact, his real name was Israel Gelfand. He was originally from Russia and is considered an economic genius. In his youth, Parvus set himself just 2 goals: to become fabulously rich and to destroy Russia. Israel Gelfand got millions not from the German treasury, as many think, but from the Warburg banking house. Parvus was the mentor of that very 25-year-old Trotsky, whose birth name was Leba Davidovich Bronstein, Trotsky's mentor. He returned from America without a party or any particular influence in revolutionary circles, but he rose to prominence in this field in just a matter of moments. How did he, a young and inexperienced man, manage to rise so quickly to the revolutionary Olympus? The mechanism that triggered the 1905 revolution becomes clear when you see the family connection between Trotsky and the banker Abram Zhivatovsky, who, in turn, was connected to the Warburg brothers. Let us recall that it was Max Warburg who was influenced by his father-in-law, Jacob Schiff. It's hard to ignore Parvis's extensive program called Preparation for a Mass Political Strike in Russia. It contained the following provision about a mass strike under the slogan Freedom and Peace, which should start in Petrograd and cover the arms factories and railway lines, about agitation among workers in the port cities of Odessa, Sevastopol, and at the shipyards in Nikolaev, about the escape of political prisoners from Siberia and using them as revolutionary agitators in Petrograd, about using the Russian press in Europe, which would influence the position of neutral countries and push them to join the war on the side of Germany, about Ukraine, incitement against Russian rule, for autonomy, especially among peasants, to overthrow the Russian Tsar. In July 1918, Schiff sent a message through United States diplomatic channels to the Russian Bolsheviks with an order to eliminate the former Emperor Nikolai II and his family. The Bolsheviks, who were forced to flee from Yekaterinburg in haste, did not have time to destroy all the tapes with telegraph messages. After Yekaterinburg was taken by the Whites, Nikolai Sokolov, the author of this investigation, found these tapes in the telegraph building. He collected the tapes, but couldn't decipher them. The decoding was done by a group of experts in Paris. It was only in 1922 that Sokolov discovered that the telegrams were quite incriminating, as they were directly related to the murder of the Tsar and his family. Chairman Yakov Sverdlov sent a telegram to Yakov Yurovsky, stating that after notifying Yakov Schiff in New York about the White Army's approach to Yekaterinburg, Schiff ordered the Tsar and his family to be liquidated immediately. This order was delivered to Sverdlov through the American mission, which was then located in Vologda. Sverdlov ordered Yurovsky to carry out this ruthless order. But the next day, Yurovsky decided to check whether the order really applied to the whole family or only to the former emperor. Sverdlov confirmed that the entire family was to be eliminated, and Yurovsky was appointed responsible for carrying out the order. There are ongoing discussions about what happened next, and whether the royal family was actually killed. But we'll talk about that another time. Let's note, Russian military investigator Boris Brazol, called an investigator by the grace of God by his peers, had been assigned to the United States since 1916 and stayed after the revolution. In the archives of the State Department, his report Bolshevism and Judaism, dated 1918, is kept, in which it is asserted the decision to overthrow the Tsarist government was made on February 14, 1916, in the Jewish quarter of New York by a group of revolutionaries led by banker Jacob Schiff. Well, now it's time to move on to the next clan, which has already been mentioned several times throughout this film. The Warburgs are the largest banking clan in the world. What makes them notable? What did they do in the past? And what are they doing now? Before talking about the Warburgs, it's important to note that it's impossible to discuss the banking elite without considering family ties, since most of these clans have been intermarrying for centuries. This is exactly how, since the 19th century, and partly since the 18th century, a close-knit international banking network was formed, consisting of close and distant relatives. Here's a figure for you. Interfamily marriages made up half of the 59 marriages contracted by the Rothschilds in the 19th century. Remember, one of the main points of the so-called Rothschild will was exactly that men should marry their cousins and second cousins. Of course, they didn't only choose relatives as advantageous matches. Connections among top banking figures were also strengthened, although, in essence, it was the absorption of various dynasties into the largest banking clan, including with a change of surname along the male line. For example, the daughter of the royal court banker of Bavaria and Prussia, the Sicilian and Austrian consul General Karl Rothschild, married Maximilian Goldschmidt, who came from a Frankfurt banking family, and he immediately became Baron Goldschmidt Rothschild. Here's another example like that. Abraham Montefiore, a representative of the oldest English branch of the Jewish aristocracy, who married the daughter of Amschel Rothschild, was offered to change his last name to Rothschild in order to be allowed into financial affairs. Later, this Montefiore Rothschild became the exclusive banking overseer of all Australia. Kalman Rothschild's 1818 marriage to to Edelheit Hertz, future favorite of the Neapolitan king, gave the Rothschilds business ties and an indirect family link to the Oppenheimers. At the same time, each of these marriages elevated their aristocratic status, which was a deliberate family policy. They raised their status once again in 1814 when they became related to the Warburgs. Now let's take a closer look at this clan. This is a Sephardic family with the telling name Del Banco, originally from Venice, where they were among the wealthiest. It was the Venetian Jewish diaspora that became the cradle of the modern global financial elite, the wealthiest and largest Jewish financial group in Europe at the time. They lived compactly in one city, but due to their historical connections with other regions, they controlled capital flows throughout all of Eurasia. The economic position of Venice was based on usury and the slave trade in the Mediterranean. Then, due to many factors, the slave trade began to decline throughout Europe. The decline of the Venetian Republic sparked the exodus of Jews from Venice to northern Europe. At the same time, the migration of Jews and the outflow of their capital did not occur chaotically, but under the control of the so-called Venetian Party. The financiers of this organization worked on securing the future of their capital, and as part of these events in the 16th century, the branch of the clan in question moved to Scandinavia and England. At the same time, the Copenhagen branch of the family kept the Venetian surname Del Banco. Another part of the family moved to Germany, settling in the city of Warburg. At the same time, the migrants changed their real name to the name of the city, where they decided to stay. Pretty ambitious, isn't it? Just about 220 years ago, representatives of this German branch of the clan, brothers Moisey and Gershon, newly named in Warburg, founded the Warburg & Cormer Bank. During the rule of Sigmund and Moritz, two nephews of Moisey, one of the founders, the bank becomes the leading private bank in Europe. Then, the Warburgs expand their influence, founding banks in London and New York. One of the nephews, Moritz Warburg, in turn, marries into the Oppenheimer clan. The five sons from this marriage with Charlotte Esther Oppenheimer, Abby, Max, Paul, Felix, and Fritz, become the Magnificent Five, as they were called in Germany. All five were born in Hamburg, graduated from high school there, and instead of higher education, they did internships in their clan's banks. Only Abi went to universities, but he didn't become a banker. We'll discuss that later. One of the brothers from this Magnificent Five, Max Warburg, continues the family business. Before World War I, he advised Kaiser Wilhelm and managed the bank. In 1918, he was offered the position of Minister of Finance in the government. He refused, believing that he would inevitably be seen as an agent of big Jewish capital. Among other things, Max Warburg was a member of the General Council of the Reichsbank, that is, the Central Bank of Germany, from 1924 to 1933. In the 1930s, Max and his bank were key in carrying out the 1933 Havre Agreement between the Jewish Agency and the Nazi government. This was the beginning of the plan to relocate the Jews of Germany to Palestine, which ultimately led to the creation of the State of Israel. Max was also a member of the board of the chemical syndicate Farben Industries, the most important corporation of the Third Reich. In 1938, he emigrated to the United States, which saved him from Nazi persecution, as well as from the post-war trial that all the leaders of the syndicate faced. Let's cross the ocean with him and take a look at another brother from the Magnificent Five, Paul Warburg. Meet the father of the United States Federal Reserve System. At the age of 27, he marries Nina Loeb, the daughter of Solomon Loeb, one of the founders of the New York bank Kuhn, Loeb Ampersand Company. Thus, he became brother-in-law to the bank's director, Jacob Schiff, who was already married to Solomon's other daughter, Teresa. In 1902, Paul moved to the United States and began working at his father-in-law's banking company. In 1910, he attended a secret meeting of top bankers, where the idea for the United States Federal Reserve System was created and later reported to Congress. After the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in 1914, Paul was chosen as one of the first 5 members of the central bank's board of directors. Is there any point in explaining that the United States Federal Reserve is a private banking institution that stands above the official authorities of America. But that's not all. Here's another key detail. In 1929, the so-called Council on Foreign Relations acquires its own building. A significant portion of the funds for this purchase was contributed by the then director of the council, that very same Paul Warburg, and John Rockefeller contributed the remaining part. What is the Council on Foreign Relations, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and others like it? It's essentially a think tank, the largest closed-order structure of the American elite. From 1945 to 1972, about 45% of foreign policy positions in the United States government were simultaneously held by members of this organization. Joining it was essentially a rite of initiation for any foreign policy figure. And the CIA, the most famous United States intelligence agency, was led in its first decades by members of this council, such as Allen Dulles, John McCone, William Colby, and others. And Paul Warburg also founded the Carl Schurz Foundation, which was one of the organizations where the idea of controlling the planet's population was developed. Knowing all this, it's no surprise to hear the words of Paul Warburg's son, James Warburg, who said the following in 1950, "We will have world government, whether we like it or not. The only question is whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest." Let's move on to the third brother, Felix Warburg, who was born just under 150 years ago. He moved to the United States in 1894, and in the same year married Frieda Schiff, the daughter of Jacob Schiff. He also began working at Kuhn, Loeb ampersand Kaufrud, where his father-in-law was president and his older brother already worked. Paul Felix became one of the founders of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, contributed to the development of Jewish settlements in Eretz Israel, and supported the Palestine Economic Corporation and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. In 1927, he visited the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as one of the leaders of the Agro-Joint Project. He visited 40 Jewish settlements in Crimea and Ukraine that were established thanks to this project. What was this project? The creation of a Crimean Israel that people don't usually talk about nowadays. In 1929, an agreement was signed under which the Soviet Union received about $1.5 million annually from the Joint. In return, 375,000 hectares of Crimean land were pledged as collateral, formalized with shares purchased by more than 200 United States citizens, including the well-known Roosevelt, Hoover, Rockefeller, and Marshall. In 1936, after the Soviet state had received a total of $20 million, this project, known as Crimean California, was closed and forgotten, and the funds stopped coming in. The issue was revisited in 1943 at the Tehran Conference, when Roosevelt informed Stalin that his administration would soon have problems with supplying the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics through Lend-Lease if the Crimean California project was not revived. In 1954, the deadline for returning the money received for New California would come. According to one version, the transfer of Crimea under the jurisdiction of Ukraine, whose leadership, by the way, long resisted such an idea from Nikita Khrushchev, was supposed to complicate American attempts to make claims for the transfer of the formerly pledged territory of the peninsula. The fourth eldest brother traded banking schemes for books. Abe Warburg did not like the Jewish religious rituals that were scrupulously observed in the family, and he rejected all career plans related to banking at an early age. He also did not want to be a doctor or a lawyer. When Abe was 13 years old, without hesitation, he made a deal with his brother Max, who was 12, agreeing to give up his right as the eldest son to become the head of the family bank in exchange for Max's obligations, to provide him with all the books he would need. Years later, Abe would become the founder of a huge library on art studies with more than 300,000 volumes, which would turn into the London Institute bearing his name. He studied archaeology, art history, psychology, and religious history in Bonn, Munich, and Strasbourg, and defended his dissertation on 2 Botticelli masterpieces. In 1895, Abe made a long journey across the United States, where he devoted a lot of time to studying the culture of Native American tribes. Hopi. In 1897, He married the artist Maria Hertz against his father's wishes. She was the daughter of a Hamburg senator and a member of the Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. Abe settled with his wife in Florence, where their friends included famous writers, artists, sculptors, and art historians. Fritz Warburg, the youngest of the 5 brothers, founded the Hamburg Metal Exchange and the bank's matching department. Fritz always had Jewish friends. He loved speaking Yiddish and adored stories about life in Jewish shtetls. All Jewish traditions were observed in his family, and his brothers called Fritz their Jewish conscience. After his father's death, he became the head of the Jewish community in Hamburg. It should be noted that the wealthy Hanseatic city of Hamburg became a refuge for many European Jews. The most powerful Jewish community in Germany emerged in Hamburg. The Germans still refer to this narrow but extremely influential Jewish group as Kaiser Juden, Imperial Jews. Fritz and his family left Hamburg for Sweden in August 1938, right after Max left for New York. But just a month later, he went back to Hamburg. But after Kristallnacht, the situation in Germany changed dramatically. And when Fritz was supposed to return to Sweden a couple of days later, the Gestapo arrested him at the airport. He spent more than 6 months in prison, along with several hundred other arrested Jews from his Hamburg community. Fritz was saved by the German banker Cornelius von Berenberg-Gossler, with whom he served on the board of directors of the National German Bank. Cornelius managed to negotiate in Berlin with Himmler's aide Heydrich about a deal in which Fritz was supposed to ransom 100 Jews before sending them and himself to Sweden. Fritz spent his final years in Israel, passing away in a kibbutz, the last of the famous Warburg brothers 5. That's the kind of clan you definitely won't hear about in history class, although he had more influence on it than some public rulers. And now, as promised, the intrigue. What are the Warburgs doing now? Let's take a look. Here is Bettina Warburg giving lectures on blockchain. Here she says that the only thing separating us from a bright crypto future is a lack of trust. After everything you've seen, do you really think blockchain is the bright future of the whole planet? And are all these cryptocurrencies really the invention of honest anonymous programmers capable, like Neo, of breaking the matrix? Write in the comments what you think about this topic. Now, let's move on to the next clan. All 12 branches of the United States Federal Reserve Bank are controlled by 10 huge private banks. N.M. Rothschild in London, Rothschild Bank in Berlin, Warburg Bank in Hamburg, and Warburg Bank in Amsterdam, Lehman Brothers in New York, Lazard Brothers in Paris, Kuhn Loeb Bank in New York, Israel Moses, Safe Bank in Italy, Goldman Sachs in New York, and finally, John Pierpont Morgan Chase Bank in New York. We have already talked about many of the clans mentioned. It's time to expose the Morgans' activities. The Federal Reserve Bank was established in 1913. In that same year, the head of the American banking clan, John Pierpont Morgan, died, and the Rockefeller Foundation was formed. The Morgan clan. He led the American financial system from Wall Street almost 200 years ago, playing the role of the American central bank since 1838, when George Peabody established a similar central bank in London. Peabody was also a business partner of the Rothschilds. The Rothschilds initially used John Pierpont Morgan Ampersand Company to operate in the United States without revealing their influence. This is confirmed by the actions of the Morgans from 1895 to 1896 in selling American gold bonds in Europe. These operations relied on an alliance with the Rothschild clan. The Morgans also worked with the Astor, DuPont, Guggenheim, Vanderbilt, and Rockefeller clans. They financed the rise of industrial giants such as General Motors, General Electric, and DuPont. In this regard, it's useful to recall the history of the relationship between Morgan and Nikola Tesla, which we've already talked about. Let us briefly remind you that Nikola Tesla's wireless electricity threatened to cut off the enormous profits of the Guggenheims, the Baruchs, and Morgan himself. They had invested heavily in copper mining in Alaska, driven industrial demand for non-ferrous metals for wires, and for rubber used in insulation. But still, Even large-scale industry will never be as profitable as banking manipulations. Alongside the London banks of Rothschild and Baring, the Morgans became a global financial structure, taking root in many countries. In 1890, the Egyptian central bank borrowed money from the Morgans. They financed Russian railways, issued bonds for Brazil, and funded large-scale construction projects in Argentina. The recession of 1893 also contributed to the growing influence of the Morgans. That year, the Morgans saved the American government from a banking panic. Thus, they formed a syndicate to support the government's reserves with a supply of Rothschild gold worth a total of $62 million. The Morgans were the driving force behind America's industrial expansion to the West. They financed and controlled the railroads. In 1879, the Morgan-financed New York Central Railroad gave favorable terms to the emerging Standard Oil Company of John Rockefeller. Strengthening their connections, the Morgans became increasingly intertwined with the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers. John Pierpont Morgan joyfully declared, "Just think, the entire railroad west of St. Louis will come under the control of just 30 people." Quite. Morgan and the banker Kuhn Loeb held a monopoly on the railroad, while the banking dynasties of Lehman, Goldman, Sachs, and Lazard, together with the Rockefellers, controlled the industrial base of the United States. In 1903, 8 major clans, Goldman Sachs, Rockefellers, Lehmans, Kuhn, Loebs, Rothschild Warburgs, Lazards, and Israel Moses Seifs, founded Bankers Trust. Benjamin Strong from this gangster trust was the first president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The Morgans had close relations with the British Windsor dynasty and the Italian Savoy dynasty, and all of the 8 clans mentioned above were also close to European royal families. By 1895, Morgan controlled the entire flow of gold going both into and out of the United States. In 1897, there were 69 industrial mergers organized by bankers. Just 2 years later, there were already 2,000. Was there anyone who noticed that all of America was falling under the power of banking capital? Of course. Many considered wealthy Americans to be puppets of European bankers, calling them traitors who worked for European money. Standard Oil of Doyle Rockefeller, United States Steel, Andrew Carnegie, and Edward Harriman's railroads were all financed by banker Jacob Schiff of Kuhn, Loeb Ampersand Co., and he, in turn, closely cooperated with the Rothschilds from Europe. Several Western states even banned the activities of bankers. William Jennings. Bryan was the Democratic presidential candidate 3 times from 1896 to 1908. The central theme of his campaign was the idea that America was falling straight into the trap of financial slavery to British capital. Roosevelt won the election in 1908, but because of the spread of these ideas, he was forced to adopt the Sherman Act, the first antitrust law in the United States. In 1912, the Pujo Committee held hearings to examine the concentration of power on Wall Street. That same year, Edward Harriman's wife sold her substantial stake in New York's Guaranty Trust Bank to John Pierpont Morgan, which led to the creation of Morgan Guaranty Trust. During President Woodrow Wilson's administration in 1914, the Clayton Act was passed to regulate the activities of trusts. But of course, that didn't stop anyone. Jack Morgan, the heir son of John Pierpont, responded to this by urging his clients Remington and Winchester to increase arms production. He argued in favor of the idea that the United States needed to enter World War I. Under the control of the oligarchs, Wilson gave in. How was profit made from the war? For example, like this. Before military action began, the French Rothschild Company and the Morgans issued $100 million in bonds, with most funds staying in the United States, to pay for American goods bought by the French. The Morgans financed half of the United States military economy, while at the same time choosing companies like General Electric, DuPont, United States Steel, and other Morgan clients as contractors. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was chaired by Morgan. According to the Jesuit logic of the Klan, he oversaw measures to restore both Germany and the Entente. The 1930s. The Americans had another attempt to see the truth. After Goldman Sachs, Lehman Bank, and other bankers only benefited from the stock market crash of 1929. Here is a quote from those years by a high-ranking official, the chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency, Louis McFadden. About the Great Depression, he said this: "It was not an accident. It was a carefully planned event. International bankers wanted to create an atmosphere of despair here so they could appear as our rulers. Senator Gerald Nye led an investigation into military supplies in 1936. The official concluded that the Morgans dragged the United States into World War I to protect their loans and create a rapidly growing military industry. The Morgans responded to this by preparing for entry into World War II. They had close ties with the two wealthiest families in Japan, Iwasaki and Dan, who owned Mitsubishi and Mitsui respectively. Morgan also had close ties with the Italian fascist Benito Mussolini, and Hjalmar Schacht acted as an intermediary between the Morgan Bank and German banking structures during World War II. By the way, it's noteworthy that this figure, having once served as president of the Reichsbank, Reich Minister of Economics, and one of the main organizers of the Nazi German war economy, was brought before the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg as one of the main war criminals. But, like other untouchable individuals who hold significant positions in the global banking hierarchy, he was fully acquitted as early as October 1946. And a little later, after the war, representatives of the Morgan family met with Schacht at the Bank for International Settlements. What is the Bank for International Settlements? It is a key institution that legitimizes the money master's power over the planet. It is the most influential bank in the world, the global central bank of 8 families who controlled the private central banks of almost all Western and developing countries. The first president of this bank was the Rockefeller banker Gates McGarrah, an official of Chase Manhattan and the Federal Reserve. His grandson, Richard Helms, became the director of the CIA. The Bank for International Settlements doesn't make headlines because money prefers silence, and external control over national monetary issuance even more so. The G20 later emerged from the structures of the Bank for International Settlements. The so-called G20 has a core, first-tier countries, and a periphery, second-tier countries treated as stepchildren. The meaning of a system with a core and periphery is simple and cynical. Decisions are made in the core, and the periphery is invited just to push those decisions through and give them legitimacy. In 2009, at the London G20 Summit, the Financial Stability Board was established within its structure. Once a year in November, the Financial Stability Board publishes lists of banks that are too big to fail, and the corresponding central banks help them with freshly printed cash. Of course, the assistance is provided to the same list of banks. Central and private commercial banks serve together on the BMR Board of Directors. But that's not all. The BMR has a conceptual center that is formally not part of its structure, the Group of 30, or G30, in which there are roughly equal numbers of former heads of central banks, including reserve issuing centers and private bankers. Almost always, retired central bankers end up with highly paid positions on the boards of private banks, intertwining their personal interests with them. In the Group of 30, state interests are placed below private ones. Roughly speaking, if the BMR is an external center in relation to the G20, then the G30 is the same kind of external center in relation to the BMR itself. And this means that the global financial and monetary system within the existing framework is under the reliable control of the oligarchy. And the other structures of the World Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, extend oligarchic control to the United Nations and its institutions, promoting the globalist agenda through sustainable development and peace-building. Subtitle editor and proofreader, A. Kulikova, Agencies. They are private, and states depend on these ratings. If in the past you had to send tanks into an undesirable country, now it's enough to downgrade its rating. The owners of the share capital of the leading transnational banks and companies are all the same: institutional investors and mutual investment funds. 10 to 15 of the same asset management companies. Moreover, their own shares, in turn, are under mutual cross-management. Here's their approximate list: Capital Group, Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, John Pierpont Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Barclays, and others like them. The ultimate beneficiaries of the global economy are their real owners, and it's not so easy to get to them through the intertwined system of front owners. Thus, the entire so-called market economy is actually not managed by any group of 7 or 20, nor by the invisible hand of market competition, and not even by the United Nations, but by the monopolies of a very narrow circle of individuals. Kiosks near train stations compete, while oligarchs make deals and divide spheres of influence and resources, and with them, global power in the system called global capitalism. What do you think? How can we get out of this cage? Is it possible to create our own alternative system? And who is capable of doing that? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, and we ask you to give this video a fair rating if you think the information in this episode deserves attention. See you soon on Cremola.